The 7 men who rejected Evelyn Carter never looked back. They walked off that platform with younger women on their arms, women without children, without worn suitcases, without the quiet desperation of someone who had already lost everything once and couldn't afford to lose again. The last one, a wheat farmer from outside Billings, had looked directly at Lily and Rose and said it plainly, loud enough for half the platform to hear. "I came for a wife, not somebody else's leftovers." Evelyn didn't flinch. She had trained herself not to. But her hand tightened around Lily's small fingers, and Lily, who was 6 and had not yet learned to pretend the world was kinder than it was, looked up at her mother's face and went very still. That was the moment Evelyn understood. There was no mercy in this place, no second chances handed out by strangers. Whatever she was going to build for her daughters, she would have to build it herself, out of nothing, with no one's help, in a town that had already decided she wasn't worth the trouble. She was 30 years old, and she had never felt so completely alone in her life. If you've ever stood somewhere and felt the ground disappear beneath your feet, not from falling, but from being told you don't belong, then you already know what Evelyn Carter felt on that platform in Red Hollow, Montana. Before we go further into this story, if you're new here, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Stories like Evelyn's are what we bring you every week, and you don't want to miss what happens next. Hit the like button if you're already feeling something, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. It genuinely means something to know how far these stories travel. Now, back to Red Hollow, back to the platform, back to the moment everything was about to change. The morning Evelyn Carter arrived in Red Hollow, Montana, the sky was doing what Montana skies did in late October, pressing down low and gray, heavy with the promise of weather that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to rain or freeze. The platform at the Red Hollow station was crowded with people who had come to watch, not out of any particular warmth toward the women stepping off the train, but because there wasn't much else to do on a Thursday, and the arrival of mail-order brides from the east was the closest thing the town got to theater. Evelyn stepped down from the train car last, not because she was slow or uncertain, but because she had spent the final hour of the journey in the small, rattling washroom, trying to get the travel grime off her daughters' faces with a damp cloth and the last of the soap she'd brought from St. Louis. Lily had cooperated. Rose had not. Rose had opinions about soap and faces and the entire concept of being cleaned, and by the time Evelyn got her presentable, her own hair had come half out of its pins, and she didn't have a free hand to fix it. She stepped onto the platform with a worn leather suitcase in one hand, Lily's fingers in the other, and Rose attached to her coat like a small, determined anchor. Her hair was falling down on one side. Her traveling dress, which had been her best dress 3 years ago, was now simply the dress she owned that was least obviously in need of repair. She looked like what she was, a woman at the end of a very long journey who had not yet arrived anywhere safe. The program coordinator, a stout woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who wore a hat that had seen better seasons, moved down the line of arriving women with a clipboard and an expression of brisk efficiency. She registered the others first, a girl of 19 from Ohio, 2 sisters from Pennsylvania, a widow from Tennessee, who carried herself like she'd already survived worse than this, and probably had. Each woman was checked off, directed to stand in a designated area, and introduced in turn to the men who'd come to make their selection. When Mrs. Aldrich reached Evelyn, she glanced at the twins, then at Evelyn, then made a small notation on her clipboard that she didn't explain. Carter. Evelyn Carter. She said it like a confirmation rather than a greeting. "You disclosed the children in your correspondence?" "I did," Evelyn said, "to every one of them." Mrs. Aldrich looked at her clipboard again. "You're listed as having 7 prior correspondences through the program." "That's correct." The woman's expression didn't shift exactly, but something in it settled into a particular shape. The look of someone doing arithmetic and not liking the sum. "Well," she said, and moved on. 7 correspondences. 7 men who had written to her over the course of 14 months. Men who had read her careful letters, her honest descriptions of herself and her situation, her clear-eyed accounting of who she was and what she came with. 2 daughters. No money. Practical skills, willingness to work. A strong constitution and a stubborn refusal to be defeated by circumstances that had defeated women with more resources than she'd ever had. 7 men had found that accounting insufficient. The first had withdrawn after her second letter, when she described the girls in enough detail that he could no longer treat them as an abstraction. The second had written back to ask if there was any possibility the children could be placed with relatives, and Evelyn had not written back at all. The third had come to see her in St. Louis, had sat across from her at a boarding house table for 40 minutes, and had then excused himself to use the necessary and never returned. She'd found out later he'd sent Mrs. Aldrich a note saying he needed someone who could give him children of his own. The fourth, fifth, and sixth had each cited variations on the same theme. The children were too young, too many, too present. One of them had put it with a bluntness she almost respected. He wasn't looking to raise another man's family. The seventh, the wheat farmer from Billings, she had met on the platform that morning, before she'd even set down her suitcase. He had walked over to introduce himself, looked at Lily and Rose for approximately 4 seconds, and said the thing about leftovers loudly enough for half the crowd to hear. Lily had not understood the word in the way it was intended. Rose had understood enough to know it wasn't kind. She had pressed her face into Evelyn's coat and stayed there, and Evelyn had stood very still with her hand in Lily's and let the moment pass over her like bad weather. Something you couldn't stop, only endure. She moved to the far end of the platform after that, where the light was thinner and the crowd thinner, and no one was looking at her with particular interest. She watched the other women find their futures in the span of an hour. The girl from Ohio went with a young rancher who couldn't keep the smile off his face. The Tennessee widow sized up 2 different men before selecting one with the calm deliberation of someone choosing good lumber. Even the last of the Pennsylvania sisters, who had seemed the most nervous of all of them on the train, walked off the platform with a man twice her age who offered her his arm like it was something precious. The platform emptied the way platforms do. Gradually, then all at once. Evelyn was left standing at the end of it with her suitcase and her daughters, and the particular quality of silence that follows when you have been made unnecessary. She was trying to calculate options. It was what she did when feeling threatened the possibility of becoming panic. She converted it into arithmetic. She had enough money for 3 nights at a boarding house if the rates were modest. She could wire Mrs. Aldrich's office in St. Louis to report the situation, though she wasn't certain what that would accomplish. She could look for work in Red Hollow itself, though what a woman with 2 6-year-old twins and no local connections could find in a frontier cattle town in late October was not immediately obvious. She was running through the numbers for the 4th time, getting the same results, when she heard it. The horse came before the man did. The sound of hooves on the main street, not the careful, measured pace of a working animal, but something faster and more purposeful, a horse covering ground because its rider intended to cover ground. The sound reached the platform before the animal came into view, and several of the remaining bystanders turned to look. Nathaniel Blackwood rode into Red Hollow the way he did most things, without particular announcement and without much apparent concern for what anyone thought about the timing. I was a large man on a large horse, both of them trail-dusty and moving with the particular efficiency of beings that spent most of their lives outdoors. He had the look of someone who had ridden a long way and would ride a long way home, and regarded this in-between stop as a logistical necessity rather than a social occasion. He was not young, late 30s, maybe older. The outdoors aged men unevenly out here, carved some of them down to wire and dried leather, and left others with a solidity that looked like it had been there a long time and intended to stay. Nate Blackwood was the second kind. He wore his wealth the way working ranchers sometimes did, which is to say, he didn't wear it at all. The coat was good quality but old, the boots were better, and neither suggested a man who spent much thought on appearances. The town knew him. That was obvious from the way people straightened slightly as he tied his horse at the post and came toward the platform. Not out of warmth, exactly, but out of the particular attention people paid to someone whose opinion of you had material consequences. Mrs. Aldrich intercepted him with the clipboard. "Mr. Blackwood, I wasn't certain you'd make it today." "Finished up early," he said. Not apologetically, not expansively, just as a fact. "I'm afraid most of the ladies have already been matched," she said, with the careful tone of someone managing expectations. I can see what's here." He was already looking past her. Not at Mrs. Aldrich, not at the few remaining bystanders, not at the empty end of the platform where the day's commerce had been conducted. At the far end of the platform, where the light came down thin through the overhang, Evelyn Carter was trying to fit Rose's coat button back through its loop. Rose was not helping with this effort. Lily had found a crack in the platform boards that was absorbing her complete attention. Nate Blackwood walked past Mrs. Aldrich and her clipboard. He walked the length of the platform at the same pace he'd come through town. Not hurrying, not hesitating, just moving in a direction he'd decided on. The bystanders watched. A few of them exchanged glances. None of them said anything. He stopped in front of Evelyn. She looked up from Rose's coat button. Whatever she'd expected to see when she looked up, another rejection, a curious stranger, someone with a question. It wasn't this. A man standing in front of her with the bearing of someone who had made a decision and had not yet needed anyone else's opinion of it. "Evelyn Carter?" he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment, then at Lily, who had abandoned the crack in the boards to stare at him with the frank assessment of a 6-year-old who had learned to read strangers quickly. Then at Rose, who had gone still against Evelyn's side with the particular stillness of a child who has been unsettled enough times that stillness has become a protective instinct. "Nathaniel Blackwood," he said. "I run the Blackwood Ranch, north of here. About 40 miles. "I know who you are," Evelyn said, "or who people say you are." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but the structural predecessor of one. Something that acknowledged the distinction she'd made. "What do people say?" "That you're the wealthiest rancher in the territory," she said. "And that you came here to pick from the selection, same as everyone else." "I came here to find someone capable," he said. "Not the same thing." She held his gaze. She had been doing that all day, holding the gaze of men who looked at her and found her lacking, and she had developed a certain steadiness in it. "Then you walked past everyone else on this platform to find capable." "The others made their choices quick," he said. "Fast choices on important things are usually lazy choices." Lily, who had been listening with the attentiveness of a child who understood more than adults expected, tugged on Evelyn's coat sleeve. Evelyn glanced down. Lily looked at Nate Blackwood with an expression that was half challenge and half calculation, and said, "Are you going to say something mean about us?" The silence that followed was brief but complete. Nate crouched down, which put him at approximately Lily's eye level, and looked at her with an expression that Evelyn couldn't quite read. "Why would I do that?" he said. "The last man did," Lily said simply. He looked at her for another moment. Then he stood back up and looked at Evelyn. "I have a ranch that needs running," he said. "I have about 14 ranch hands who are competent at cattle work and competent at almost nothing else. I have a house that has not had anyone manage it properly in years. I need someone who can handle all of that." A pause. "I don't need someone who makes my life easy. I need someone who can build something with me." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She had been rejected enough times in the past 14 months that she had learned to look for the catch in things. The condition people didn't name until later, the expectation they revealed only after you were already obligated. "You know I have 2 children," she said. "I can see that." The others considered them a problem. "The others aren't here," he said. "Why not?" It was a direct question, more direct than was probably expected of her, and she watched to see if it bothered him. It didn't seem to. He thought about it for a second, like someone who'd been asked something reasonable. "Because I've had enough experience with livestock to know that an animal that looks healthy but won't thrive in hard weather is worth less than an animal that looks ordinary but lasts." He paused. "I know that's not a flattering comparison." "It's an honest one," Evelyn said. "You've been standing at the end of this platform for about an hour," he said. "You watched 7 different men pass you over and you're still standing here with your back straight. That's what I came for." She thought of the wheat farmer's voice carrying across the platform. The word leftovers, said like it meant nothing, like she was nothing, like the 2 small people pressed against her sides were nothing. She thought of the 14 months of careful letters and careful hope and careful disappointment. She thought of the arithmetic she'd been doing in her head. 3 nights, no connections, late October, 40 miles from anywhere. "I don't know the first thing about running a cattle ranch," she said. "I don't need someone who knows cattle," he said. "I need someone who knows how to manage difficult situations with incomplete information and make the best possible decision anyway. From what I can see, you've been doing that all day." Rose, who had been observing this entire exchange from behind Evelyn's coat with one eye, chose this moment to step out from behind her mother entirely and look at Nate Blackwood with the kind of direct assessment that Rose reserved for things she was trying to determine the fundamental trustworthiness of. He looked back at her with the same unhurried attention he'd given everything else. "Do you have animals?" Rose said. "Many," he said. "What kind?" "Cattle, mainly. Some horses. 2 dogs that consider themselves in charge of the situation." Rose appeared to weigh this. "Dogs that think they're in charge are usually good," she said, and stepped back behind Evelyn. Nate looked at Evelyn again. "My proposal is a practical one," he said. "I am not a man who has time for anything else. The arrangement would be a proper marriage, with everything that entails in terms of what I can provide for you and your daughters. In return, I need a partner in running the ranch operation. The house, the accounts, the workers, the supply management. It's not a small job." "I understand what I'm agreeing to," Evelyn said. "Then do you agree?" She stood on the empty platform in a town that had decided she wasn't worth keeping, with her daughters on either side of her and the smell of coming weather in the cold air. And she looked at Nathaniel Blackwood and tried to find the deception in him. The catch. The thing he wasn't saying, she didn't find it, which didn't mean it wasn't there, but she had learned in the past several years to make decisions on the information available rather than on the information she wished she had. "I agree," she said. He nodded, once, like a man confirming a business arrangement, and reached down and picked up her suitcase before she could reach for it herself. Not gallantly, practically. The way someone picks up a thing that needs to be carried. Lily fell into step on one side of Evelyn. Rose fell into step on the other. They walked off the platform together, the 4 of them, and behind them the bystanders watched in the particular silence of people witnessing something they had not anticipated and had not yet decided how to account for. One of them, a man named Harold Greer, who ran the general store and had opinions about most things, said to the woman next to him, "That's a mistake." The woman next to him, who had been watching Evelyn Carter's back as she walked away, said nothing. She wasn't sure she agreed. The road north out of Red Hollow was 40 miles of hard country, and they traveled it in Nate's wagon because the horse he'd ridden in on was tied to the back and would have been too much for the girls to manage. He didn't talk much. Evelyn didn't fill the silence artificially. She'd learned that the instinct to fill silence was usually more about managing the other person's comfort than your own, and she had her own things to think about. Lily fell asleep against Evelyn's arm before they'd gone 10 miles. Rose fought sleep with the determination she brought to everything she didn't want to do, and lost the fight around the 15-mile mark, sliding slowly sideways until she was lying across both of them. Nate glanced over at some point in the second hour. "They sleep deep," he said. "They always have, even when things were bad." He returned his attention to the road. The sky had made its decision about weather and elected for a hard, dry cold instead of snow, the wind coming off the mountains with the kind of bite that got into coat seams. Evelyn pulled the blanket she'd found in the wagon floor up around both girls and tucked it in the way she'd done 10,000 times. "What was bad?" he said after a while. Not prying, just asking. She considered how much to say. Then she decided that she was past the point where strategic omissions served any purpose. "Their father died 2.5 years ago. Fever. He was 29, she paused. "We had a farm. After he died, I couldn't hold the mortgage alone. I tried for 8 months and then I couldn't anymore." She paused again. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me." "I don't," he said. Not unkindly, factually. "Good," she said. The wagon moved through the dark. The land out here had a particular quality at night, immense and indifferent, the kind of landscape that didn't notice you at all, and either you found that terrifying or you found it honest. Evelyn, to her own mild surprise, found it honest. "The man on the platform," Nate said eventually. "What he said." "It doesn't matter." "It matters that you heard it," he said. "It shouldn't have been said." She looked at him in the dim light. It was an odd thing for him to volunteer, for a man who had presented himself as wholly practical. "You weren't there," she said. "Mrs. Aldrich told me when I arrived," he said, "before she gave me her clipboard." Evelyn said nothing for a moment. Then, "It wasn't the worst thing anyone said?" "That doesn't make it acceptable." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." They rode on. The road curved north, and the mountains that had been a smear on the horizon started to develop definition, their shapes asserting themselves against the dark sky with the particular authority of things that had been there long enough to stop caring whether you acknowledged them. Somewhere around the 30th mile, Nate said, "The ranch has been without a proper household manager for 4 years. Things work, but they don't function, if you know the difference." "I know the difference," Evelyn said. "The Hands are decent men, but they're used to having no one in the house, and they may take some adjusting to the change. I've managed difficult people before." He glanced at her. "What kind?" "Grieving people," she said. "People who are afraid and won't say so. People who've decided in advance that you're going to fail, so they can say they knew it." He was quiet for a moment. "That last kind is the ranch hands," he said. "Fair warning." "I appreciate the warning," she said. The last 10 miles passed in the particular cold that came in the hours between midnight and dawn, and when the shape of Blackwood Ranch came into view, the main house, the outbuildings, the dark bulk of the barn against the lighter dark of the sky. Evelyn looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. It was bigger than she'd expected. Not elegant, no one built for elegance out here, but solid and permanent in a way that spoke of intention, of someone deciding this place was going to last and building accordingly. The main house had a wide porch that ran the length of the front. Light came from one window on the ground floor, left burning by someone who'd expected their employer home. Nate brought the wagon to a stop. He got down first and reached up for Rose, who didn't wake, and held her with the uncertain competence of a man who had rarely held children but was paying close enough attention to get it right. Evelyn climbed down with Lily, who stirred and murmured something and went back under. They carried the girls inside. The house smelled of wood smoke and coffee and the particular staleness of rooms lived in by men who don't notice staleness. The housekeeper's room off the kitchen had 2 narrow beds that must have been prepared in advance, whether by Nate or by someone he'd told she didn't know. She laid Lily down first, then took Rose from Nate's arms and got her settled beside her sister, and pulled the blanket up around both of them. She stood in the doorway of the small room for a moment. Behind her, in the kitchen, she could hear Nate putting on the stove, the sound of iron against iron, competent and unsentimental. She turned and went back to the kitchen. "You should sleep," he said, not looking up from the stove. "In a minute," she said. She stood at the kitchen table and looked at the house around her. The worn counters, the practical arrangement of things, the window above the sink that would face east when the sun came up, the door to the back that probably led to the yard and the outbuildings. She was calculating again. Not escape routes this time. Possibilities. "The accounts," she said. "When do you want me to start on those?" He looked up from the stove. Something in his face registered a particular quality of attention, the look of a man recalibrating an expectation slightly upward. "Not tonight," he said. "Tomorrow then," she said. He went back to the stove. "Tomorrow," he agreed. She went to the room the girls were in and lay down on the narrow strip of bed that remained, Lily's warmth against her back, and listened to the wind come off the mountains and move against the house. The house held against it. Not perfectly. She could hear the places where the wind found edges, the small sounds of a structure doing what structures do in weather, but solidly the way things held that had been built right. She was in a stranger's house, in a marriage contracted that afternoon on a train platform, 40 miles from a town that had spent the day telling her she wasn't enough. Her daughters were asleep beside her. The man in the kitchen had picked up her suitcase without being asked and had said quietly and without performance that what had been said to her on that platform shouldn't have been said. She did not feel safe. She had not felt safe in so long that she'd stopped expecting the feeling as a baseline condition. But she felt something else, something smaller and more durable than safety. She felt like she was in the right fight. She closed her eyes and let the wind do what it was going to do. The sun came up over the eastern ridge at Blackwood Ranch, the way it did everything out here, without asking permission, without ceremony, just a hard line of light that moved across the land and said, "Another day, whether you're ready or not." Evelyn was already in the kitchen. She had been awake since before the light, lying in that narrow bed with Lily's warmth at her back and Rose's quiet breathing on the other side. And she had run through everything she'd observed on the way in. The layout of the house, the condition of the kitchen, the arrangement of outbuildings she could see from the wagon, the things Nate had said and the things he hadn't. She had a habit of doing this, taking inventory in the dark, when the world was quiet enough to think clearly without someone else's needs pressing in on her. It was something she'd started during the 8 months she'd tried to hold the farm alone after Daniel died, and she hadn't stopped. The kitchen was functional but neglected in the specific way of a space where no one had taken real ownership of it in a long time. Things were clean enough. The ranch hands clearly understood basic sanitation. But nothing was organized with any intention. The flour sack was on the wrong shelf. The oil lamp on the table needed its wick trimmed. There were 3 different skillets hanging on the wall, and none of them had been properly seasoned in months, which she could tell just by looking at the surface. She found coffee and started it. She found oats. She found a half wheel of hard cheese that was still good, and a crock of preserves that someone had put up. Probably not recently, probably not here, possibly purchased in town. She started what she could and stood at the kitchen window and watched the dark outside begin to separate into shapes. She was on her 2nd cup of coffee when she heard the hands. They came in from the bunkhouse the way men did when they didn't expect anyone to be in the main kitchen, loud, and without particular regard for their surroundings. The door came open and 3 of them walked in talking before any of them registered that the stove was going, and a woman was standing at the window holding a coffee cup and watching them arrive. The talking stopped. There were 3 of them, a tall, raw-boned man in his 40s who had the look of someone who'd been doing physical work his whole life and had no particular feelings about it one way or the other. A younger one, 20-something, with red in his beard and the slightly startled expression of someone who processed new information slowly but thoroughly. And a third, who was shorter and darker and had already started to smile, either at the situation or at her. She couldn't yet tell which. "Morning," Evelyn said. The tall one found his footing first. "Morning." He looked at the stove, then back at her. "Didn't know Nate was bringing anyone back." "I imagine there's quite a bit you didn't know yesterday," she said. Not unkindly. She handed him the coffee cup she'd just filled because she'd seen him look at the pot the way thirsty men looked at water. "Evelyn Blackwood. I'll be managing the household from here." The name felt strange in her mouth. She'd said it for the first time just now, without planning to, and it sat there in the morning air like something that hadn't fully solidified yet, but was getting there. The tall man accepted the coffee with the automatic response of someone who needed it too much to think about the social mechanics of the situation. "Tom Garrett," he said. "I run the south pasture." The younger one with the red beard had recovered enough to come the rest of the way into the kitchen. "Pete Dunnigan," he said. "That coffee smells—" He stopped, recalibrated. "Real good, ma'am." The shorter one, who had never stopped smiling, said, "Cal Reyes. I fix things when they break, which is frequent." He looked at the skillets on the wall, then back at her. "You going to reorganize the kitchen?" "Already started," she said. He looked at Tom Garrett. Tom Garrett looked at his coffee. Nate came in from the back of the house about 10 minutes later, and by that time Evelyn had 6 people in the kitchen. 3 hands she'd already met, 2 more who'd come in from the far bunkhouse, and a boy of about 14 named Willis, who served as general help, and had attached himself to the edges of the situation with the instinct of a young person who doesn't want to miss anything important. Nate took in the scene with one sweep of the room and then looked at Evelyn across it with an expression that she was beginning to identify as his version of approval, a slight reduction in the neutral set of his features, as if he were releasing a small amount of tension he'd been holding. He poured himself coffee and sat at the head of the table and said, "You've met some of the hands." "Working on it," she said. Tom Garrett, who was apparently senior enough to speak plainly, said to Nate, "You might have given us some notice." "I didn't know until yesterday," Nate said. "Still." "You'll adjust," Nate said. Not harshly, just with the finality of a man who had made a decision and was not revisiting it. Tom looked at Evelyn, not hostilely, but with a measuring quality she recognized, the look of someone deciding how much latitude to extend before you'd earned it. "No offense intended," he said. "None taken," she said, "and you don't have to adjust all at once. I'm not here to reorganize anyone's way of doing things. I'm here to make this house run better than it does, which shouldn't be hard given the state of those skillets." Pete Dunnigan made a sound that was almost a laugh and converted it quickly into a cough. Cal Reyes didn't bother with the conversion. Tom Garrett's mouth did something complicated and settled somewhere near neutral. "Fair enough," he said. Lily and Rose came out of the side room 20 minutes later, sleep-rumpled and still in the clothes they'd traveled in, and walked into a kitchen full of strange men without hesitation. Rose stopped in the doorway and took a full inventory of the room with the systematic attention she brought to any new environment. Lily walked in and sat down at the table next to Pete Dunnigan because there was a biscuit in front of him, and she had correctly identified him as the person least likely to object to sharing. The hands looked at the children the way men sometimes looked at things they hadn't expected and didn't know the protocol for. Not unkindly, but with the slight awkwardness of people who'd been living without that particular variable for a long time and needed a moment to recalibrate. Willis, the 14-year-old, was the only one who didn't hesitate. He slid the biscuit plate toward Lily with the ease of someone who had younger siblings and knew how children operated. "You want one?" Lily took two. Rose came and sat beside Evelyn, pressed close, and ate without speaking. She was watching the men the way she watched most new things, patiently, like someone doing a long calculation. Nate watched all of this from the head of the table. He said nothing, but he was paying attention in the particular way he paid attention to things. Not obviously, not with any performance of observation, just with a quality of awareness that didn't miss much. After breakfast, he took Evelyn out to walk the property. It was not a romantic walk in any sense of the word. It was a working tour, conducted at a working pace, and he spoke about the ranch the way he talked about everything, directly, without embellishment, with the assumption that she was capable of understanding what she was being told if it was told clearly. He showed her the South Pasture situation, a fencing problem that had been ongoing, 3 sections of post and rail that needed replacing before winter made access impossible. He showed her the supply building and the current state of provisions, which were adequate in some areas and inadequate in others, and told her the next supply run was scheduled for 2 weeks out. He showed her the barn and the horses and the 2 dogs, who were named General and Senator, which he explained without particular humor had been Willis's doing. She asked questions. He answered them. She asked several that he hadn't expected, based on the slight change in his attention when she asked them. About the account system, about the arrangement with the Red Hollow General Store, about whether the supply orders went through Mrs. Aldrich's office in any capacity or directly to the supplier. He answered all of them with the same directness, and only once said, "How do you know about that system?" "I manage the accounts for our farm," she said. "Not a big operation, but the principles are the same." He looked at her for a moment. "I'll get you the ledgers after lunch," he said. The ledgers were a revelation, and not a good one. Not because anything fraudulent had been done. The records were basically honest, but they were disorganized in the way of records kept by someone who is good at the underlying work and merely tolerates the paperwork as a necessary nuisance. Things were recorded, but not categorized. Expenses were noted, but not tracked against each other. There were 3 different systems that appeared to have been started at 3 different times, none of them completed, all of them partially overlapping in ways that made it difficult to get a clear picture of where the money was actually going. She spent the afternoon at the kitchen table with the ledgers spread across it, making notes on a piece of brown paper she'd found in the supply room. And by the time the light started going, she had a preliminary picture of the situation that was complicated enough to require discussion. Nate came in from the far pasture after dark, and she waited until he'd eaten something. She'd made stew with what was available, which wasn't fancy but was sufficient. And then she sat across from him at the table and said, "I need to talk to you about the accounts." He looked up from his bowl. "Good news or bad?" "Neither yet. Preliminary." She turned the brown paper toward him. "Your feed costs are higher than they should be for the herd size you're running. Either you're overpaying on delivery or there's something going wrong between the invoice and what's actually arriving. I can't tell which from these records because the inventory notes and the purchase records don't match." He looked at the paper. "I've had the same supplier for 6 years." "That's not evidence," she said. "It's familiarity." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When can you have a full picture?" "Week, maybe less, if you can answer some questions about the past 2 years." "All right," he said. It should have been a straightforward exchange. It was. But when she gathered up the papers and started to rise from the table, he said, "Evelyn." She stopped. "You did well today," he said. "With the men, with the girls, with—" He made a brief gesture toward the ledgers. "All of it." She stood with the papers in her hands and looked at him. He was not a man who gave compliments lightly. She'd already understood that much about him, which meant the words weighed more than they would have from someone who said them freely. "I had a long time to think on the wagon last night," she said, "about what this was going to need. And I think," she said carefully, that what it needs is someone who won't pretend it's easier than it is. He looked at her. That's what I thought too, he said. She went to check on the girls. The first week was not smooth. She had not expected it to be. The hands were adjusting, which meant they were not quite hostile and not quite cooperative. They were in the particular middle state of people who have decided to wait and see, which at least meant they weren't actively working against her. Tom Garrett was the key. She understood that immediately. He had the senior position and the natural authority that came with age and competence, and the others looked to him when something new was introduced to determine the acceptable response. If Tom Garrett decided she was tolerable, the rest would follow. If he decided she was a problem, she'd have 14 different versions of the same problem every day. She focused her energy accordingly, not through strategy or manipulation. She'd found that people usually saw through both eventually, and the recovery cost more than the initial gain. She did it by doing the job, consistently and without complaint, and by asking Tom Garrett's opinion on things she actually wanted his opinion on, rather than things she was asking about just to make him feel consulted. On the third day, she asked him about the fencing problem in the south pasture. He'd mentioned it at breakfast the first morning in passing, and she'd held on to it. Nate said there are 3 sections that need replacing before winter, she said. I want to understand what's involved so I can account for it in the supply order. Materials, time, how many hands. Tom looked at her with that measuring look. Why do you need to know that for the supply order? Because if I'm ordering supplies and I don't account for the labor schedule, I'll order the wrong things at the wrong time, and someone will be standing in a half-finished pasture in December wondering where the cedar posts are. He was quiet for a moment. Then he started talking about the fencing problem, in the specific practical detail of someone who knew it well and had been wanting someone to ask who would actually understand the answer. She listened. She took notes on the brown paper she'd been using for everything. She asked 2 follow-up questions that prompted another 10 minutes of explanation. When he finished, Tom Garrett said, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" He considered it honestly. "Someone who'd want to change everything at once," he said, "or someone who wouldn't want to touch anything because it wasn't her place." "Neither of those works," she said. "No," he agreed. "They don't." That was day 3. On day 5, the real problem arrived, and it came in the shape of a woman named Dorothy Crane. Dorothy Crane was the wife of Gerald Crane, who owned the second largest cattle operation in the territory, and who had made no secret of his opinion that Nathaniel Blackwood's land practices were aggressive, and his fencing strategies were designed to disadvantage his neighbors. The Cranes and the Blackwoods had been in a low-grade territorial dispute for several years, nothing that had come to anything serious, but the kind of sustained friction that shaped the dynamics of a community and everyone in it. Dorothy Crane arrived at Blackwood Ranch on the 5th morning in a buggy driven by a hired hand and accompanied by 2 other women from the Red Hollow Ladies' Social Committee. And she presented herself at the front door with the particular combination of social warmth and strategic intent that Evelyn had seen before in women who were skilled at using courtesy as a form of pressure. Evelyn answered the door herself. The girls were at the kitchen table with a primer she'd found in a crate in the back room, someone's books, possibly Nate's from a long time ago, and Willis was in the yard. "Mrs. Blackwood," Dorothy Crane said, with a smile that had been calibrated to be just slightly too warm to reject. "I'm Dorothy Crane. We've been hoping to call on you since we heard the news. May we come in?" She was perhaps 50, well-dressed in the frontier sense of the word, with a face that had once been handsome and was now interesting in the way that faces became when the original structure was good and time had added depth without subtracting the underlying quality. She was also, Evelyn understood immediately, someone who had spent years being the most influential woman in this county and was in the process of deciding what exactly this newcomer's arrival meant for that position. The 2 women with her were younger and less legible. They had the look of people present to observe rather than participate. "Of course," Evelyn said, and stepped back from the door. She showed them into the front room. She did not apologize for the state of the house, because the house was presentable. She'd spent part of the first 2 days getting it there. She offered coffee because it was the appropriate offer and not because she was eager to please, and she went to get it without hurrying. When she came back, Dorothy Crane had arranged herself in the best chair and was looking at the room with the comprehensive attention of someone taking inventory. "I was so surprised to hear the news," Dorothy said, accepting the coffee cup. Nathaniel has been on his own for so long, most of us had given up on the idea of him marrying. I imagine he gave up on the idea himself for a while, Evelyn said, sitting across from her, and then changed his mind. Of course, Dorothy Crane smiled. And with children, too. How lovely. How old are they? 6. Both the same age. A small pause. Twins. Yes. And their father passed away, Evelyn said, not defensively, just closing the line of inquiry with the minimum information necessary to satisfy it. Dorothy Crane received this with a sympathy that was probably genuine in part, and tactical in part. I'm so sorry, she said. You've been through a great deal. I have, Evelyn agreed. There was a brief silence. One of the other women made a small sound that was meant to express empathy. Dorothy Crane took a sip of coffee and set the cup down with the careful delicacy of someone preparing to say something that had been planned to sound spontaneous. I hope you'll join us for the ladies' social committee meetings, she said. We meet every second Wednesday in town. It's really the heart of the community. Information sharing, support for families in need, coordination during bad weather. Nathaniel's always been the kind of man who values community standing. I'm sure he'd be pleased to see you taking an active part. Evelyn heard all the things that sentence was carrying. The emphasis on community standing, the suggestion that Nathaniel's reputation was implicated in her behavior. The social committee as a space Dorothy Crane controlled and was offering access to on terms she would subsequently set. Thank you, Evelyn said. I'll look forward to it once we're a bit more settled. Of course, Dorothy Crane smiled again. There's no rush, though I should mention the committee is discussing the Winter Relief Fund at the next meeting. The Blackwood Ranch has historically been one of the larger contributors. It would be wonderful if you were there. There it was, not a threat, nothing so crude, but a very clear indication of the landscape. Evelyn was being invited into a social structure, and the terms of the invitation included the expectation of deference. I'll mention it to Nathaniel, Evelyn said pleasantly. Dorothy Crane stayed another 30 minutes. She was gracious throughout, and charming in the genuine way of someone who had developed charm as a functional skill rather than an ornamental one, and she said nothing that was explicitly hostile or obviously manipulative. But when the buggy pulled away and Evelyn stood on the porch watching it go, she felt the shape of the situation with a clarity that had taken her a long time to develop, the particular feeling of having been assessed by a skilled assessor. She went back inside and found Rose standing in the kitchen doorway. Who was that? Rose said. A neighbor, Evelyn said. She kept looking at the house, Rose said, like she was counting things. Evelyn looked at her daughter for a moment. 6 years old, and she noticed things like that. She was, Evelyn said. Some people do that. Why? Because knowing what someone is tells you something about them, Evelyn said, or they think it does. Rose considered this. Does it? Sometimes. Not always. Evelyn moved back to the kitchen table and the primer she'd set out. Sit down and let's work on your letters. She told Nate about the visit that evening. He was at the table with the ledgers. She'd been working through them with him in the evenings, going over questions that required his knowledge of the operation, and he listened without interrupting until she finished. Dorothy Crane doesn't come calling for nothing, he said. No, Evelyn agreed. She came to see what I was. And what do you think she decided? I think she decided I wasn't certain enough to be dismissed and wasn't obviously manageable enough to be absorbed, Evelyn said. So she's waiting. He looked at her across the table. You've met women like her before. I've met the type, Evelyn said. Different names, same architecture. Something shifted in his face again. That slight release of tension that she was beginning to understand was his version of being impressed. What do you want to do about it? Nothing, for now. There's nothing to do about it yet. She picked up the pencil she'd been using to annotate the ledger margins. She's going to wait to see if I make a mistake before she decides on an approach. So the thing to do is not make a mistake. Simple enough, he said, with the slight dryness that had turned out to be the texture of his sense of humor. Straightforward isn't the same as simple, she said. He returned to the ledgers. She returned to her notes. The house was quiet, except for the fire and the wind outside, and the distant sound of the girls talking in the room they'd been given. A real room now, the second bedroom upstairs, which had been used for storage and which Willis and Pete Dunnigan had cleared out in an afternoon without being asked, on what Evelyn suspected was Tom Garrett's indirect instruction. She had not thanked Tom Garrett for that directly. She'd thanked Pete and Willis in front of him, specifically enough that he would know she understood where it came from, and she'd watched his face receive that acknowledgement with the very slight satisfaction of a man who had done a decent thing and been correctly seen. Progress was not clean, it was not linear. It came in increments so small they were sometimes invisible until you looked back from a distance and realized the ground had shifted. The account irregularities were the next thing that broke into the open. Evelyn had been working through the feed supplier records for several days, cross-referencing them against the inventory logs she'd found, and the notes Tom Garrett had given her about actual herd consumption. The numbers didn't match, not catastrophically. It wasn't the kind of discrepancy that announced itself, but consistently, in a way that pointed to a pattern rather than an error. She presented it to Nate on a Sunday evening when the hands were off duty and the house was quiet. She had it laid out on the table, 3 columns of figures on brown paper, the invoice amounts on one side, the received quantities on the other, the difference in the third. The difference, across 18 months of records, amounted to something significant. Nate looked at it for a long time without speaking. Vernon Mills, he finally said. Vernon Mills was the feed supplier he'd used for 6 years. I don't know if it's him or if it's somewhere in the delivery chain, Evelyn said. I can't tell from the records, but someone has been invoicing for more than is arriving. How long have you been looking at this? Since the 3rd day, she said. He looked up from the papers. You found this in 3 days. I found the pattern in 3 days. It took until now to be certain enough to show you. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire cracked in the stove. Outside, the wind was doing what it had been doing all week, working at the edges of things, finding the places where the cold could get in. Vernon Mills came to my father's funeral, Nate said. It was not said as a defense of the man. It was said like someone setting a weight down on a scale to understand what it amounted to. I know that doesn't mean it wasn't him, he continued. It doesn't, Evelyn said, but it also doesn't mean it was. You need better records going forward either way. Yes. And you need to verify the next delivery yourself, she said. Count it before anyone signs the invoice. I'll do it. I can come? She said. He looked at her. You want to come to a feed delivery? I want to understand the full picture, she said. And I want whoever is receiving those deliveries to know that someone is paying attention now. He was quiet again. Then, all right. She began to gather up the papers, stacking them in the order she'd use for reference. When she'd finished, she looked up and found him still watching her. What? She said. Nothing, he said. But that slight shift in his expression, tension releasing, almost like exhaling, was back again. Nothing at all. The delivery came on a Thursday, 3 days later. Nate was there. Evelyn was there. Tom Garrett was there, which had been Nate's idea, because Tom had the kind of presence that people registered as serious without it needing to be explained. Vernon Mills arrived with his wagon and 2 men and the same easy manner of a man who had been doing business with someone long enough to treat the relationship as settled. He was perhaps 65, stocky, with a gray beard and the wind-battered look of a man who spent considerable time outdoors. He registered the change in the reception immediately. His eyes went from Nate to Evelyn to Tom Garrett and back to Nate. Nathaniel, he said, heard you got married. I did, Nate said. This is Evelyn. She's been going through the accounts. The pause that followed was brief, maybe a second, but Evelyn had been watching Vernon Mills's face when Nate said it, and she saw the pause, and she saw what was in it. Not guilt, not exactly, but a recalibration. The look of someone who understood that a variable had changed. Good to meet you, Vernon said to Evelyn. And you, she said. We'll count the load before we sign. Another pause, shorter this time because he'd already adjusted once. Of course, he said. They counted it. The load was 12 units short of the invoice. Vernon Mills looked at the count. He looked at Nate. He looked at Evelyn, who was holding the invoice and looking back at him with an expression that had nothing aggressive in it, just attentive, clear, and entirely steady. Delivery error, he said. Must have been loaded short. I'll have the difference out by end of week. We'll adjust the invoice now, Evelyn said, and going forward, we'll be counting every delivery. Vernon Mills nodded slowly. Fair enough, he said. He did not meet her eyes when he said it. Nate paid the adjusted invoice without comment. When the wagon had gone and it was just the three of them in the supply yard, Tom Garrett looked at the loading dock for a moment and then said, "That's been happening a while." "Yes," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "How much?" "Enough to matter," she said. Tom Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good catch," with the tone of a man who did not say things like that often, and meant it when he did. She walked back to the house. The wind had come down off the mountains again, finding the collar of her coat, and she put her head down against it the way you did when you'd been out here long enough to understand that the wind didn't stop because you wanted it to. Lily and Rose were in the yard when she came through the gate, engaged in some game with General and Senator that involved a length of rope and a philosophical disagreement between the dogs about who was in charge of it. Rose was explaining something to General with considerable patience. Lily had given up on the explanation and was attempting to interest Senator in a stick instead. Evelyn stood at the gate for a moment and watched them. 2 months ago, she had been standing on a platform in Red Hollow with her daughter's hands in hers, running arithmetic that didn't add up. Now she was standing at the gate of a working ranch where the dogs knew her daughter's names, and the senior hand had just told her she'd done a good job. And the man she'd married 3 weeks ago had looked at her across a kitchen table at night with the particular expression of someone beginning to trust a thing they hadn't expected to trust. It wasn't security. Not yet. Security was a thing built over time, from repetition and consistency and 1,000 small choices accumulating into something that held weight. She knew that. She wasn't naive enough to call what she had security. But it was ground, solid, cold, difficult Montana ground, the kind that pushed back when you stood on it. She had been standing on nothing for so long that even ground that pushed back felt like something. Rose looked up from her conversation with General and saw Evelyn at the gate. "The delivery men left early," Rose said. "They did," Evelyn agreed. "Was something wrong?" Evelyn came through the gate and let it swing shut behind her. "Something was being done incorrectly," she said. "Now it won't be." Rose considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "Did you fix it?" "Yes," Evelyn said. Rose nodded once, satisfied, and went back to General. Lily abandoned Senator and came and leaned against Evelyn's arm in the way she sometimes did, not asking for anything, just making contact, the way children did when they were checking that you were still there. Evelyn put her arm around her and stood in the cold yard and felt the wind and the dogs and the sounds of the ranch going about its business all around her. The house was behind her. The mountains were in front. The sky was doing what it did out here, enormous and indifferent and honest. And somewhere in the south pasture, Tom Garrett was probably already back at work on the fencing problem. And somewhere in the barn, Pete Dunnigan was most likely talking to a horse about something that didn't need to be said aloud but felt better for the saying. She had 12 ranch hands who were cautiously deciding she might be all right. She had a husband who looked at the ledgers with her at night and said less than most men would have and meant more by the less. She had daughters who were teaching frontier dogs the correct social hierarchy and losing the argument cheerfully. She was not safe. She had Dorothy Crane on one side of the ledger and the question of Vernon Mills and the full extent of the supply irregularity still to be resolved. She had a house that still needed work, accounts that still needed ordering, a community that had not yet made up its mind about her, and a marriage that was 3 weeks old and built on practical terms and had not yet been tested by anything that practical terms alone couldn't cover. But she was here. She was standing on the ground. And Evelyn Carter, Evelyn Blackwood, had learned a long time ago that standing on the ground was where everything else began. The first snow came in the second week of November, and it came the way bad things often did out here. Not with warning, but with a gradual intensification that you didn't fully register until you were already inside it. Evelyn had been watching the sky since morning. She'd grown up in Ohio, where snow announced itself with a particular quality of light and a stillness in the air that you learned to read the way you learned to read a person's face, not from any single feature, but from the accumulation of small signals that added up to something you understood before you could explain it. Montana snow was different. Montana snow didn't announce. It arrived. By midday, the temperature had dropped far enough that she could see her breath in the kitchen, even with the stove going, and by early afternoon, the world outside the windows had gone. The particular flat white that meant visibility was reducing and would continue to reduce. She had the girls inside before noon. She had the supply room inventoried by one. She had a conversation with Willis, who was the youngest and the one most likely to underestimate the weather, because youth had not yet taught him sufficient respect for things that could kill him, in which she told him clearly and without negotiating the terms that he was not going to the South Barn for the rest of the day, and that General and Senator could manage one afternoon without his supervision. Willis had the grace to look only moderately put out about this. Nate had ridden out to the east pasture that morning before the sky started doing what it did. Tom Garrett was with him, so were three of the hands. They had not planned to be gone long. A fence assessment, a look at the water situation at the East Trough, but long and not long were different calculations when weather moved in fast, and by 2 in the afternoon, Evelyn was standing at the kitchen window watching the snow come sideways and calculating. She was not panicking. Panic was a thing she'd learned to defer, to put in a mental space that she could access later when it was useful and not now when it wasn't. What she was doing was thinking, which looked similar from the outside but produced different results. Pete Dunnigan came in from the bunkhouse, stamping snow off his boots, who was one of the three hands who had stayed behind, and he came into the kitchen with the slightly guilty energy of someone coming to check on something they'd been trying not to worry about. "They know to come in when it gets like this," he said. It was meant to be reassuring, but it came out like a question. "Tom Garrett knows," Evelyn said. "I'm not certain about the others. Tom won't let anyone do anything stupid. Tom will be managing the fence situation and the horses and the visibility and Nate all at the same time," she said. "People managing multiple things make different decisions than people managing one thing." Pete looked at the window. The snow was still coming sideways. "We could ride out. You could ride out and then I'd have more people to worry about," she said. "Stay here." He stayed. They came in at 3:30. Evelyn heard the horses before she saw anything. The barn door, the particular sound of animals being brought in fast, voices in the yard. She had hot coffee on the stove and she did not go to the door because going to the door would require opening it, and opening it would let the cold in, and the cold did not need more points of entry than it already had. Nate came in first. Snow in his coat, on his hat, on his eyebrows, which struck her as almost comically excessive until she saw the set of his jaw and understood that the ride back had been serious. Tom Garrett came in behind him with two of the others. The third, a hand named Bud, 30-something, the one she'd had the least direct contact with because he worked the Far Eastern sections and wasn't often in for meals, came in last with his left hand wrapped in a piece of cloth that had been his scarf and was now doing different work. "What happened?" she said. Not a question, a direction. "Wire," Nate said, already pulling his coat off. "Fence wire. He got turned around in the whiteout and went down in a section we'd started clearing." Bud's face was the particular gray-white of someone managing pain with concentration. "It's not that bad," he said, which was what men said when things were bad enough to require management. Evelyn had already moved to the supply cabinet. She'd reorganized it in her second week, in part because reorganizing supply cabinets was something she knew how to do and it needed doing, and in part because she understood from farming that the things you reached for quickly in an emergency needed to be where your hand expected them. She had the clean cloth, the spirits, the needle and thread that she hoped would not be necessary but had put within reach anyway. "Sit," she said to Bud, "at the table." He sat. She unwrapped the scarf from his hand with the careful steadiness of someone who had done this before, not with fence wire, but with farming injuries, which arrived in their own variety of ways. The cut was deep along the outer edge of his palm, from the base of the little finger down toward the wrist. It had bled considerably and was still doing so, but it was clean. The wire had cut rather than torn, which was the better of the two options. She cleaned it. Bud's face went from gray-white to a more urgent color, and back again. He said a word under his breath that he then said, "Excuse me, ma'am," about, which she ignored because it was not the relevant concern at the moment. The room had gone very quiet. Pete Dunnigan was watching from near the stove. Willis was in the doorway. Tom Garrett was standing to one side with his arms folded and the expression of a man who was deciding something about what he was watching. Nate was watching her hands. "It needs closing," she said. "Either we take him to town or we do it here." "Town's not possible tonight," Nate said. She had expected that answer. She'd prepared for that answer. "Then hold his arm still," she said. Nate came and held Bud's arm. Bud looked at the ceiling with the focused detachment of a man finding a mental location that wasn't this room. Evelyn worked with the needle and thread from the sewing kit she'd moved to the top shelf of the supply cabinet 6 days ago without explaining why she'd moved it. She said while working, "Tell me something about where you're from, Bud." He looked down from the ceiling, surprised by the question. "What?" "Something about where you grew up," she said. "Anything. I just need you talking." He talked. He was from Kentucky originally, had come west at 17, had worked cattle for 12 years. He talked in the halting, distracted way of someone whose attention was divided between narrating and managing what was happening to his hand, which was the point. Divided attention was easier to manage than focused attention, and she needed him still. When she finished, she tied off the last stitch with the brisk economy of someone who had done what needed doing and was now doing the next thing, which was bandaging. The room exhaled. "Good as I can do tonight," she said. "He needs to keep it clean, and he needs to stay off that hand for at least 4 days. Bud looked at his bandaged palm. "I can't be off for 4 days. "You can be off for 4 days, or you can lose the hand," she said pleasantly. "Which would you prefer?" He looked at Nate. Nate looked back at him with the expression of a man who was not going to argue with that assessment. 4 days, Nate said. Bud looked at Evelyn. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Tom Garrett, from the side of the room where he'd been standing with his arms folded, said, "That was clean work." "I've had practice," Evelyn said, washing her hands at the basin. "Farm?" "Farm." He nodded once. Something in the node had a quality she recognized as the final settling of something he'd been carrying, a question he hadn't asked that had now been answered without asking. Later that night, after the snow had committed fully to the world outside, and the house was as close and warm as it was going to get, Nate came to the kitchen where Evelyn was sitting with the ledgers and the notes she'd been accumulating about the Vernon Mills situation and 2 additional supplier accounts she'd started reviewing. He sat down across from her without being asked. "You knew it might come in like that," he said. "I've been watching the sky since this morning." "You had everything ready." "I didn't know what I'd need specifically," she said, "so I made sure I had options." He was quiet for a moment. He did this. Let silence develop past the point where most people felt the need to fill it, which she had come to understand was not absence but a particular kind of presence. He was thinking. "The feed account," he said. "Have you gotten further on the others?" She had. She pulled the second sheet of brown paper across the table toward him. 2 more suppliers showing similar patterns, not as significant as Mills, but consistent. She pointed to a column. "This one goes back further, almost 3 years. Nate looked at the numbers. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 3 years, possibly more. I only have reliable records going back 3 years. He sat back. The fire made a sound in the stove. Outside, the snow was still falling, though quieter now. The sideways violence of the afternoon had settled into the steady vertical fall that would continue through the night and be several feet deep by morning. "I need to go to town," he said. "Talk to someone who understands the legal side of this." "You need a lawyer," she said. "We don't have a lawyer in Red Hollow." "There's one in Milford," she said. "I looked into it when I was working through the Mills account." He looked at her. "You looked into the lawyer situation." "In case you needed one," she said. "I didn't know if you would, but it seemed worth knowing." The silence that followed was different from his usual silences. It had a texture she hadn't encountered in him before. Something softer than surprise, more considered than approval. He was looking at her the way you looked at something when you were in the process of understanding it more completely than you had before. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes." "How long has it been since someone did that for you?" He stopped, started again differently. "Someone who thought ahead on your behalf." She looked at him across the papers and the lamp in the quiet kitchen. It was an unusual thing for him to say. He was not a man who moved toward personal territory without reason. "Long time," she said. He nodded and looked back at the papers, and they returned to the accounts in the way they'd developed the habit of doing, both of them at the same table, working at the same problem from their respective angles, filling in each other's gaps. It was not romantic. It was something more durable than that. The snow kept them ranch-bound for 4 days. 4 days was long enough for several things to happen, some of which she'd anticipated and some of which she had not. What she had anticipated, the close-quarters friction of 14 people in confined spaces with reduced outdoor work to manage. Men who were accustomed to the outdoors became different versions of themselves when they were stuck inside. Not worse necessarily, but more visible. You saw edges that the open land usually absorbed. She managed it by keeping the hands occupied with indoor work she'd been cataloging for exactly this kind of occasion. The harness repair that had been deferred, the storage organization in the near barn, the cleaning and oiling of equipment that worked better for the attention. She made sure there was always something warm from the kitchen at mealtimes and something to do in the hours between. What she had not anticipated, Rose. Rose had been watching the ranch hands for 6 weeks with the systematic patience of a field naturalist, and in 4 days of enforced proximity, she apparently decided she had enough data to begin interacting directly. She started with Cal Reyes, who fixed things, because Rose was interested in how things worked, and Cal was the person who understood mechanisms. Evelyn overheard this first conversation from the kitchen. Rose's precise, serious questions about how the pump mechanism in the near barn worked, and Cal's slightly startled responses that gradually settled into the real explanation as he realized she was actually following it. By the second day of the storm, Rose was following Cal around the barn in her coat and boots while he did the indoor maintenance work, asking questions with the focused intensity of someone who would not stop until she had a complete picture. Lily, who had different instincts, attached herself to Pete Dunnigan, whose response to the confinement was to tell stories. He had a lot of them. 12 years of cattle work produced a particular inventory. And Lily sat across from him at the table and listened with her chin in her hands, and interrupted regularly with questions that were mostly about horses and occasionally about whether Pete had ever been seriously scared, which he answered with the honesty that Lily tended to extract from people without quite trying. Willis, who was 14 and therefore somewhere between the children and the men in terms of social position, seemed to find the twins' integration into the workings of the ranch oddly normalizing. He started eating meals closer to where the girls sat, rather than at the far end of the table, with the older hands. Tom Garrett watched all of this from a slight remove. He was not a man who warmed easily, and Evelyn had not expected him to. She'd been working with the steady accumulation of small things, not with any expectation of transformation. But on the third afternoon of the storm, he came into the kitchen while she was working on the accounts and sat down, not because she'd invited him or because there was a particular reason to, but in the way people sometimes sat down in kitchens when the alternative was their own company and they'd had enough of that. "Rose fixed the latch on the supply room door," he said. Evelyn looked up. "She did?" Cal showed her. "She fixed it herself." He paused. "She's 6. She's been like that since she could hold a hammer," Evelyn said, "or anything else with a function." Tom was quiet for a moment. "My daughter was like that," he said. "Took things apart, put them back together mostly." It was the first personal thing he had offered. She received it carefully, without making a large gesture of it, the way you received something fragile from someone who wasn't sure yet whether they'd wanted to hand it over. "How old is she?" Evelyn said. "She'd be 12, he said. The past tense hung in the room. She did not ask about it. He did not explain it. They sat in the kitchen with the snow still coming down outside, and after a while he got up and went back to whatever he'd been doing, and the conversation was over, and some kind of accounting between them had been quietly settled. On the 4th day, the snow stopped. The sky came back hard and blue and clear, with a cold that had teeth, but was the honest cold of winter rather than the indiscriminate violence of the storm. By mid-morning, the hands were moving again, assessing damage, digging out. Evelyn sent Willis to the barn with hot coffee and a covered pot, and made breakfast for everyone, and then stood at the back door looking at the transformed landscape. Everything she could see was white. The outbuildings, the fence lines, the mountains in the distance, all of it rendered in the same monochrome that made the world look simpler than it was, reduced to shape and light and shadow. She was still standing there when Nate came up beside her. "How bad?" she said. "Fencing in the south is down in 2 places we already knew about, and one we didn't," he said. "East Trough is frozen solid, but that's manageable. Near barn has some damage to the roof overhang. Cal's already on it." He paused. "Could have been worse." "It could be worse when the next one comes," she said. "Yes." "You should ride to Milford as soon as the road is passable," she said. "The account situation shouldn't wait." "I know." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the same landscape she was looking at. I've been thinking about what you found. If it's 3 suppliers, and if it goes back more than 2 years, it's significant money, she said. Yes. You'll need to decide whether you want to pursue it legally or handle it as a private business matter, she said. Both have different costs. I can lay out what I know on paper for the lawyer either way. Do that, he said. I'll go to Milford Thursday if the road allows. Or for another minute, letting the cold air do what cold air did. Clear out the accumulated closeness of 4 days inside, sharp and clean and without sentiment. She was thinking about Vernon Mills and the other 2 suppliers. She was also thinking about Dorothy Crane, who had not called again since the first visit, but who Evelyn understood was watching. She'd felt it in the interactions she'd had in town on the one supply run she'd made before the storm, in the particular quality of attention she received from women who were part of that social structure. The attention was not hostile. That would have been easier. It was evaluative, which was more complex and required more patience to navigate. She was thinking about Bud's hand and whether it was healing correctly, and whether she should have done something differently with the closure. She was thinking about the south pasture fencing and the new break they hadn't known about. She was thinking about Lily's voice at the table last night, laughing at something Pete Dunnigan had said. The laugh fully realized and unguarded in the way Lily's laugh had not been since before Daniel died, since before the farm, before the mortgage, before the 14 months of rejection and uncertainty that had put a layer of watchfulness over both her girls that she had been grieving without naming. Rose had fallen asleep in the armchair by the fire last night, not in the careful, braced way she sometimes slept, with her arms close and her body slightly curled as if expecting interruption. She'd fallen asleep the way a child fell asleep in a safe place, completely, with her mouth open and her legs hanging over the armchair arm at a thoroughly undignified angle, and her hand still holding the piece of rope she'd been using to demonstrate a knot Cal had taught her. Evelyn had stood and looked at that for a long moment. She had not cried. She'd learned to defer that too, the same way she deferred panic. But she had stood there and felt something that she didn't have a word for exactly. Something between relief and gratitude and a grief she hadn't known she was still carrying until some of it started to lift. She went back inside and closed the door on the cold. The road to Milford cleared enough by Wednesday for Nate to make the trip, and he left before first light with the papers Evelyn had prepared. Clean copies of the account records, the discrepancy analysis, the timeline she'd constructed from cross-referencing the 3 suppliers. She'd done them over 2 evenings while the girls were asleep, working by lamplight with the same focused economy she brought to everything that mattered. Nate looked at the package before he put it in his saddlebag. "This is thorough," he said. "A lawyer will need the specifics," she said. "Vague concerns are harder to work with than documented facts." "You've dealt with lawyers before." "Once," she said, "when we lost the farm. The bank had one. We didn't." He absorbed that without comment, in the way he absorbed things, receiving them and placing them in whatever accounting he kept. "I'll be back by dark," he said. "If it looks like you won't be, don't push the road," she said. He looked at her. There was something in the look that she was beginning to recognize. Not warmth exactly, though it wasn't the absence of warmth either. It was something quieter than warmth. The look of a man who was not accustomed to being considered and was still adjusting to the experience. "I won't," he said, and rode out. He was back by mid-afternoon, which meant the lawyer had received him quickly, or the news had been clear enough to transact efficiently. He came into the kitchen where she was at the table with Rose. Rose had decided to learn to read from the same primer Lily was using, not because she was behind Lily, but because she wanted to understand the decoding system from the beginning and not skip any steps. And he set his coat on the hook and his hat on the shelf and sat down. "The lawyer thinks we have grounds," he said, "for Mills at minimum. The other 2 will depend on whether we can get delivery records from them directly." "Mills won't cooperate," Evelyn said. "No, but the lawyer says we don't need him to. The invoice records and the inventory counts are enough to make a formal complaint and pursue recovery." He paused. He also said, another pause, shorter. He said whoever put these records together knew what they were doing. Rose looked up from the primer. "Mama put them together," she said, with the mild tone of someone stating an obvious fact. Nate looked at Rose. Rose looked back at him with the direct attention she gave everything. "I know," he said. "Then why did you say it like you were surprised?" Rose said. Evelyn put her hand over Rose's primer. "Letters," she said. Rose returned to the primer, but with the slight expression of someone who had made a point and was satisfied with it. Nate looked at Evelyn. The slight shift in his expression was back. She was learning the gradations of it, the one that meant approval, the one that meant surprise, the one that was rarer and harder to name, that she only saw occasionally, usually late in the evening at the kitchen table. That meant something she hadn't given herself permission to name yet. The lawyer suggested an associate of his in Red Hollow might be able to take this on locally, Nate said. Save the travel. I'd have to bring him the papers. When? Next week. He said Thursday would work. I'll come, Evelyn said. He looked at her. You don't need to. I know the records better than anyone, she said. If he has questions, I can answer them. And if I'm there, we don't have to make 2 trips when he has follow-up questions, which he will. He conceded this with the pragmatic efficiency of a man who recognized a better argument. Thursday then, he said. The Thursday trip to Red Hollow was where things broke open in a way she hadn't expected. The lawyer's associate, a man named Arthur Cobb, young enough to have been new to his practice but old enough to have been at it for several years, and developed the particular competence of someone who'd spent those years on frontier legal matters, where the cases were messy and the clients were practical, and the outcomes were never as clean as the law suggested they could be, received them in his office above the general store, and went through Evelyn's documentation with the focused attention of someone reading something they found genuinely interesting. He asked her 4 questions. She answered all of them. He asked 2 follow-up questions. She answered those. Then he looked at Nate and said, "Where did you find her?" It was not said disrespectfully. It was the question of a man who'd been handed a set of records that were cleaner and more useful than what he usually received and wanted to understand the source. But Evelyn felt the shape of the question anyway. The way it addressed Nate rather than her, the way it implied she was something Nate had acquired. Nate looked at Arthur Cobb with the flat, level attention he used when he was about to say something he intended to land. And, "She's sitting right there," he said. Cobb blinked, looked at Evelyn. "Of course. I apologize, Mrs. Blackwood." "The question you should be asking," Evelyn said, "is whether the records are sufficient for a formal complaint. That's what matters." "They are," Cobb said. "More than sufficient, actually. I can file within the week." "Good," she said. When they came out of Cobb's office and onto the main street, the cold hit them with the directness of an honest opinion. Nate walked beside her toward the wagon and said nothing for the length of half a block. Then, "You didn't like the way he asked that?" "No," she said. "Neither did I." "I know," "No," she said. "That's why you answered it the way you did." Another half block. "Does that happen often?" he said. "Not a question exactly." "People talking around me to you, or people not expecting me to be the person I am?" "Either." "Both," she said. "Yes, frequently." He was quiet for a moment. "It shouldn't." "A lot of things shouldn't," she said. "That doesn't mean they don't." He held that thought for a moment and then let it go, not because he disagreed, but because there wasn't a solution available on a cold street in Red Hollow that would address the thing they were talking about. She knew that. She wasn't saying it to solve it. She was saying it because it was true, and he'd asked. They had almost reached the wagon when Dorothy Crane came out of the dry goods store across the street. She saw them at approximately the same moment they saw her. The calculation that crossed her face was brief and experienced, a practiced social navigator processing variables. She came across the street with the particular grace of a woman who had decided how to respond before she finished crossing. "Nathaniel," she said warmly, "and Mrs. Blackwood. What a surprise." "Not much of one," Nate said pleasantly. "It's the only street." Dorothy Crane produced a smile that acknowledged this without yielding to it. She looked at Evelyn with the careful attention she'd applied in the first visit, measuring, recalibrating. "I heard there was some difficulty with a supplier," she said. Evelyn looked at her steadily. "Did you?" "Word travels," Dorothy said, "in a town this size." "It does," Evelyn agreed. "I hope it's being resolved satisfactorily." "It is," Evelyn said. "Thank you for your concern." Dorothy Crane looked between them. Whatever she'd come across the street to assess, she was either getting it or she wasn't. And either way, the outcome was being processed behind eyes that didn't give much away. "I hope we'll see you at the committee meeting next week," she said. "The winter fund discussion is important." "I'll be there," Evelyn said. This was apparently not the response Dorothy had expected because something small shifted in her expression. A brief recalibration that she covered smoothly. "Wonderful," she said. "Wednesday at 2." She returned across the street with the unhurried poise of a woman whose social position had never genuinely been questioned. Evelyn watched her go. "You weren't planning to go before," Nate said. "I wasn't ready before," Evelyn said. "Now I am." He looked at her. "What changed?" She thought about it honestly, about the 4 days of the storm, and Tom Garrett in the kitchen, and Rose asleep in the armchair, and Bud's hand in the ledgers, and Arthur Cobb's question directed at Nate instead of her. She thought about the woman who had stood at the end of that platform 6 weeks ago, running arithmetic that didn't work. "I know the ground now," she said. "You can't fight on ground you don't know." He absorbed this and put it where he put things. "All right," he said. They drove home through the cold afternoon, and the land around them was the same land it always was, big and indifferent and honest. And the ranch came into view at the 30-mile mark the same way it always did, its shapes asserting themselves against the sky with the authority of things built to last. But something had shifted in the way she looked at it. She was no longer calculating whether she could make this work. She was calculating how. The committee meeting on Wednesday was held in the back room of the Red Hollow Ladies Society building, which was a narrow structure that had been donated by the Crane family 3 years prior, a fact that Dorothy Crane had not mentioned but that the small plaque by the door announced clearly. Evelyn arrived 5 minutes before 2 with a tin of the shortbread she'd made that morning, not to ingratiate herself, but because arriving without something at a social gathering in a frontier community was the kind of oversight that got remembered in ways that mattered later. There were 11 women in the room. She knew 2 of them by sight and none of them well. They ranged in age from perhaps 30 to well past 60, and the social architecture of the group was visible in the first 5 minutes. Who deferred to Dorothy, who deferred to those who deferred to Dorothy, and the 2 women on the far end of the back row who didn't appear to defer to anyone, and who Evelyn noted accordingly. Dorothy Crane ran the meeting with a fluid efficiency that Evelyn genuinely admired. She was good at this, the social management of a group of people with different interests and priorities, the skill of directing conversation without appearing to direct it, the timing of when to let agreement build naturally and when to introduce a new element that shifted the ground. These were real skills, and Evelyn didn't underestimate them. The Winter Fund discussion was what it was supposed to be: practical, community-focused, and also a mechanism for establishing and reinforcing the social hierarchy of who gave how much and what that meant. When it came to Blackwood Ranch's contribution, Dorothy raised the topic with the smooth indirection of someone who had practiced raising topics indirectly. "We were so grateful for the Blackwood contribution last year," she said, looking at no one in particular but orienting the statement in Evelyn's direction. "It made a real difference to the Halverson family and the Kessler situation." Everyone looked at Evelyn. She had expected this moment. She had, in fact, been building toward it since Nate had told her the amount of previous contributions, and she'd calculated what was appropriate given the supplier discrepancies and the actual state of the accounts. "We're happy to contribute," she said. "I'd like to understand the fund's administration before we finalize the amount, though. Who manages the distribution?" A brief quiet. Dorothy Crane's expression remained pleasant. "The committee manages it collectively." "Is there a treasurer's record?" Evelyn said. "Contribution amounts, distribution amounts, recipient families?" "I'm sure it's all in good order. I'd just like to understand the system before we commit a specific amount." The 2 women at the back of the room were looking at her with expressions she couldn't fully read from this angle. The women in the middle section were looking at Dorothy Crane to calibrate their response. Dorothy Crane looked at Evelyn for a moment with the steady, careful look of someone deciding on a direction. "Of course," she said. "I'll have the records available for your review before we finalize any commitments." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "That's very helpful." The meeting continued. Evelyn participated fully, not aggressively, not minimally, but as someone engaged in the actual work of the discussion, which was genuine enough that it couldn't be performed. She had thoughts about the distribution criteria that she offered when asked and held back when not. She had a practical question about the timing of last year's distribution that she'd gotten from something Tom Garrett had mentioned, and that led to a productive 15 minutes of discussion. When she left at 4 o'clock, she overheard one of the women from the back row, the older of the 2 with white hair and a direct manner, say something to the other that she didn't fully catch. But the word she caught clearly was capable. She drove home in the late afternoon light with cold hands and a clear head. Nate was on the porch when she pulled in, talking to Tom Garrett about something she couldn't hear from the gate. They both looked up when she came in. Tom Garrett said, "How was the meeting?" She tied the horse and came through the gate. "Educational," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that reading look. Then he said, "Dorothy Crane give you trouble?" "She tried a line and I moved," Evelyn said. "She'll try a different one next time." Tom was quiet for a moment. "Gerald Crane," he said, "and Nate. They've been in a dispute about the western boundary for 3 years. She stopped, looked at him. "You're telling me this now because you think it's relevant to Dorothy Crane and the committee." "I'm telling you this now," he said carefully, "because I think you're smart enough to see how it connects when you have enough of the picture." She stood in the yard between the two of them and felt the cold air and the sound of the ranch settling into evening around her, and she looked at Tom Garrett, who had stood in the kitchen at the beginning with his arms folded and decided to wait and see, who had cleared a room for her daughters without being asked, who had said good catch at the supply yard and said nothing at all in the kitchen. The afternoon he mentioned his daughter, and she understood that this was what trust looked like between people who built it slowly. Not warmth, not friendship, not yet, but the specific act of handing someone a piece of information because you had decided they would use it right. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and went back to what he'd been discussing with Nate. Evelyn went inside to where Lily was helping Willis set the table for supper, doing it wrong but with conviction, and Rose was at the window watching Cal Reyes work on the near barn roof overhang and probably cataloging his technique. The house smelled of the stew she'd put on before she left. One of the hands had kept the stove fed, which they now did without being reminded, a thing that had happened so gradually she wasn't sure exactly when it started. She took her coat off and went to the stove and stirred the pot and listened to the house around her. The sounds of it. The particular lived-in quality of a place where people were working and eating and arguing about the correct way to fold napkins and discussing roof repairs and talking to horses about things that needed to be said. She had been here 6 weeks. She had walked onto a platform with 2 children and a worn suitcase and the arithmetic of a woman with no more options, and she had walked off it into a wagon headed north toward 40 miles of hard country and a man who had said, "I don't need someone who makes my life easier." He had been right about what he needed. She had been right about what she could give. Whether either of them had been right about everything else, the parts that weren't practical, the parts she could feel developing in the kitchen late at night over ledgers and coffee, the things she was still not naming, that was a question she was leaving alone for now. There was still too much work to do, and work, she had learned, was where she had always found herself most clearly. She stirred the stew. Lily argued with Willis about the napkins. Rose pressed her nose against the cold glass of the window to watch Cal's technique on the roof, leaving a small fog circle that faded and returned each time she breathed. Outside, the Montana sky went dark the way it always did, completely, without apology, taking the light with it and leaving the stars in its place. Arthur Cobb filed the formal complaint against Vernon Mills on a Monday, and by Wednesday the news had reached Red Hollow the way news reached small frontier towns, not through any official channel but through the specific osmosis of a community where everyone's business was eventually everyone else's business, carried from the feed store to the dry goods counter to the barber shop and back again until it had traveled the full circuit and arrived, slightly altered in the details but accurate in the substance, at the ears of everyone who mattered. Evelyn knew it had spread when Tom Garrett came in for breakfast on Thursday and said, without preamble, "Vernon Mills was at the saloon last night telling people you've got a grudge against him." She poured his coffee. "What kind of grudge?" "The kind that a newcomer develops against established people because she doesn't understand how things work out here." He said it flatly, reporting rather than editorializing. "What did people say?" Tom picked up his coffee. "Depended on who was listening. Some of them have been shorted by Mills too, and know it. Some of them have been doing business with him long enough that the relationship feels like loyalty even when it isn't." "And the rest?" "The rest are waiting to see which way it falls before they decide what they think." She had expected this. She'd known from the moment she walked into Arthur Cobb's office that the complaint would not exist in a vacuum, that it would move through the community and collect interpretations along the way, and that some of those interpretations would be shaped by people who had reasons to want a particular version to prevail. What she hadn't fully anticipated was the speed. Nate took it with the studied calm of a man who had been in territorial disputes before and understood that the first phase was always noise. "Mills has friends," he said at breakfast, when she told him what Tom had reported. "Some of them are people I do business with. Are you worried about that?" He thought about it honestly, which was one of the things she'd come to count on from him. He didn't give reassuring answers when honest ones were available. "Some," he said. "The Western Boundary situation with Crane is already making things complicated. Adding a supplier dispute on top of it gives people more surface area to have opinions on." "The boundary dispute," she said. "Tom told me it's been 3 years." Nate looked at her across the table. "He told you that at the committee meeting." "He told me it was relevant to understand," she said. "He was right." Nate was quiet for a moment with his coffee. "The Western Boundary runs along a ridgeline that Crane claims his grandfather established with a verbal agreement with the previous owner before I bought the land. There's no documentation. My deed says one thing. Crane's family says another. Has anyone surveyed it?" "Crane won't agree to a survey. He knows what a survey would find." She absorbed this. "So he's been stalling for 3 years." She thought about Dorothy Crane's careful social maneuvering, the committee, the winter fund, the way she'd looked at the house during the first visit, the specific intelligence of a woman who understood that social influence was a form of pressure that could be applied without leaving marks. "Dorothy Crane hasn't been making social calls," Evelyn said. "No," Nate agreed. "She hasn't." "She's been building a picture of what I am and whether I'm manageable," Evelyn said. "And Gerald Crane has been watching the supplier complaint to see if it creates enough friction with the community that your position weakens." Nate looked at her for a long moment. "That's a precise read." "It's the obvious read if you know what to look for," she said. "I grew up watching people do versions of this with smaller stakes and less land involved. The mechanism is the same." He set his cup down. "What do you think we should do?" It was a genuine question, asked as one person asks another whose judgment they have decided to trust. She had been waiting, in some part of herself she hadn't fully acknowledged, for him to ask her something like that. Not what she'd found in the accounts, not what she'd observed in the committee room, but what she thought they should do. The difference between being consulted as a resource and being consulted as a partner was the word "we." She took her time with the answer. "The supplier complaint stays on course. That's a documented financial matter, and walking it back now would signal weakness. The committee I handle myself, and I need you to let me handle it without stepping in unless I ask." She paused. "The boundary dispute needs to be resolved. 3 years is too long. Gerald Crane is using the uncertainty as leverage, and as long as the boundary is unsettled, he has a reason to keep pressure on you from every available direction. He won't agree to a survey." "He won't agree to a survey if you ask him," she said. "That doesn't mean a survey can't happen." Nate looked at her. "A survey can be commissioned without his agreement if there's a legal basis for it." "Arthur Cobb would know," she said. He absorbed this. Then, "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since Tom told me," she said. 3 days. He didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, the ranch was starting its morning. She could hear the hands in the yard, the horses in the near barn, Willis arguing with General about something that General had done wrong, General's total indifference to the argument, the ordinary sounds of a place in motion. "All right," Nate said, "we do it your way." The committee meeting, the following Wednesday, was the one where the winter fund records were supposed to be available for review. Dorothy Crane had agreed to it with the smooth grace of a woman who had no intention of being caught without them. And when Evelyn arrived at 2 o'clock, the ledger was on the table, clean, organized, and showing 3 years of contributions and distributions with a clarity that suggested it had been prepared for presentation rather than kept in ordinary use. Evelyn sat down and opened it. She went through it with the same systematic attention she brought to the ranch accounts, and the women around the table talked about other business while she read, which was the appropriate social form and which suited her completely. She was not trying to find fault. She was trying to understand the structure of the thing. What she found was not fraud. It was something subtler and more interesting, but the fund distributed to families according to a logic that was never written down anywhere, which meant the distribution reflected the committee's judgment, which meant it reflected Dorothy Crane's judgment, which meant it was a mechanism of community influence dressed in the clothing of community generosity. The Halverson family had received help. The Kessler situation had been addressed. But there were two families Evelyn knew about from Tom Garrett, the Pickett family and an older widow named Marjorie Sands, who lived 12 miles north of Red Hollow, who had no entries in the distribution records. She closed the ledger. "Thank you," she said to Dorothy. "It's clearly well maintained." Dorothy Crane received this with the pleasantness of a woman who had been prepared for scrutiny and not found lacking. "We try to be thorough. I did notice," Evelyn said, "that the Pickett family and Mrs. Sands aren't in the distribution records. Were they considered?" A small quiet. "The committee determines need on a case-by-case basis," Dorothy said. "Of course," Evelyn said. "I only mention it because Tom Garrett said the Pickett family lost a third of their livestock in the early November storm, and Mrs. Sands is managing a loan on a property with a failing roof section." She paused. "If the committee wasn't aware, that's useful information for this year's distribution." The two women from the back row, she'd learned their names by now, Helen Marsh and Frances Aldermore, both of them ranchers' wives who had been in the territory longer than Dorothy Crane and had their own views about how things should work, exchanged a look that Evelyn caught in her peripheral vision. Helen Marsh said, "I wasn't aware of Mrs. Sands's roof situation. That sounds urgent." "It is," Evelyn said. "I thought the committee would want to know." Dorothy Crane looked at Evelyn with the careful expression of someone who has just watched a position shift beneath them and is determining the appropriate response. She was good enough at this not to react poorly. What she did instead was something that Evelyn had not fully predicted. She leaned into it. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said, "your familiarity with the community's needs after only 6 weeks is impressive. We could use that kind of attention to detail on the committee." It was an offer and an absorption attempt simultaneously. Evelyn recognized both. She accepted the offer and declined the absorption. "I'd be glad to contribute," she said. "If the committee is open to expanding the distribution criteria, I think we could serve more families effectively." The conversation that followed lasted 40 minutes and was the most substantive committee discussion Evelyn had observed since she'd started attending. Not because she dominated it. She was careful not to, because dominating a room you've recently entered is a fast way to create enemies you don't need. But she directed it by asking questions that led the group toward conclusions they would have reached themselves if someone had arranged the right sequence. By the time she left, the Pickett family and Mrs. Sands were on the list for this year's distribution. Helen Marsh had asked for Evelyn's contact information so she could share concerns about 2 other families before the next meeting. Frances Aldermore had said, as Evelyn was putting on her coat, "We've needed fresh eyes on this committee for a while," in the tone of someone who meant it as a compliment and also as an implicit commentary on the previous state of things. Dorothy Crane had walked her to the door with the unchanged social grace that was her consistent instrument, but something in the calibration had shifted. Not hostile. Dorothy Crane was not a woman who shifted to hostile without careful consideration, but adjusted, recalculating. "You're not what I expected," Dorothy said at the door. Not an apology. A concession, offered with the dignity of someone who made concessions carefully and meant them when she did. "You're not entirely what I expected either," Evelyn said. Dorothy looked at her for a moment with something that might, in different circumstances, have developed into genuine respect. "No?" "No," Evelyn said. "You care about this community. That part's real." Dorothy Crane looked at her steadily. "So does Gerald," she said, and it was the first time she had introduced her husband into a conversation directly, which Evelyn understood was intentional. Whatever disagreement he and Nathaniel have, it comes from a real place. "Most disagreements do," Evelyn said. "That doesn't make every position equally right." They looked at each other for a moment. 2 women who understood each other more clearly than either had at the beginning and who had not yet decided what that understanding meant. "Wednesday after next," Dorothy said. "I'll be there," Evelyn said. She drove home through the December cold with her hands in her heaviest gloves and the horse making a good pace on a road she now knew by its particular quality of ruts and frozen mud. The sky was doing what it did in December, going dark early, pulling the light out of the day at 4 o'clock, as if it had somewhere more important to be. She thought about Dorothy Crane's face when she'd said Gerald cares about this community. The way the sentence had 2 meanings, and Dorothy had deployed both of them deliberately. She thought about the boundary dispute. Arthur Cobb had responded to Nate's inquiry about the survey with the information that yes, under territorial land law, a property owner could commission a survey without the neighboring owner's consent, and that the results of such a survey, if filed with the Territorial Land Office, would constitute a legal record that a subsequent dispute would have to address directly. Gerald Crane's avoidance of a survey was tactical. A filed survey removed the tactic. Nate had commissioned the survey the same week. The surveyor was due in 10 days, assuming weather cooperated. Gerald Crane did not yet know about it. She pulled into the ranch yard as the last of the light gave out, and Willis came to take the horse with the efficiency he'd developed over 2 months of doing it, and which had replaced his earlier tendency to drop one of the buckles and have to retrieve it from the mud. The kitchen window was lit. Nate's horse was in the near barn, which meant he was home. She could hear Lily's voice from inside the house, rising and falling in the particular pattern of Lily telling a story, which she did frequently and at length, and with a commitment to narrative detail that Evelyn recognized as something inherited from Daniel, who had been a man who believed no story was worth telling quickly. She stood for a moment in the cold yard. She had been here 2 months. The person she was now, standing in this yard with cold hands, and the committee records organized in her memory, and the boundary survey 10 days out, and the complaint against Vernon Mills moving through Arthur Cobb's office. This person had been here 2 months. The woman on the platform felt like someone she had known, someone she could account for accurately, but also someone at a distance she couldn't quite measure. She went inside. The crisis arrived 12 days later, and it arrived as crises often did on the frontier, fast, sideways, and dressed as something else. The surveyor had come and gone. His results confirmed what Nate's deed had always stated. The western boundary ran along the ridgeline that gave Blackwood Ranch an additional 230 acres of grazing land that Gerald Crane had been treating as his own for the better part of a decade. The surveyor filed his report with the Territorial Land Office in Milford on a Friday. Gerald Crane heard about it by Saturday. He arrived at Blackwood Ranch on Sunday morning, which was the kind of timing that said he'd spent Saturday thinking about whether to come, and had made his decision by dark. He came alone, without Dorothy, without hands, which Evelyn read as either a gesture of good faith or a calculation that arriving without visible support would play better. Nate received him in the yard. Evelyn was in the kitchen and could see through the window. She stayed where she was. Crane was a large man, built like someone who had done outdoor work for 30 years and never stopped. He was perhaps 60, with a face that had been weathered into a kind of permanent severity that wasn't necessarily his character, but had become his expression. He and Nate stood in the yard in the cold and talked for 15 minutes, and she could see from the posture of both of them that it was a conversation where neither man was giving ground easily. When Nate came inside, his face had the particular closed quality it got when he was managing something rather than processing it. "He wants to negotiate," Nate said. "The survey result isn't negotiable," Evelyn said. "It's filed." "I know, he knows. He's asking for a conversation about the transition." Nate got coffee and stood at the counter. "He says the grazing on that section is important to his winter operation. He's not wrong, it's good land." "It's your land," she said. "Yes." He drank the coffee. He also said something about the supplier complaint, that it's creating tension in the community, that people are choosing sides. She looked at him. Is that his concern or a message from someone else? Nate met her eyes. He understood what she was asking. He mentioned Dorothy's name once, sighed she has real respect in this community, and hoped things could stay neighborly. There it was. The connection she'd seen from the committee room but hadn't been able to confirm directly. The supplier complaint, the boundary survey, the social committee. Not separate pressures but parts of the same structure, applied from different angles. "He's coordinating with her," Evelyn said. "Not a question. I think they've had a conversation, yes." She thought carefully. This was the moment where the wrong move was more costly than inaction. She had been building something for 2 months, in the committee room, in the supply yard, at the kitchen table with the ledgers, in Tom Garrett's gradual shift from watchful reserve to something closer to alliance. She had been building trust the way you built anything in difficult conditions, with attention, consistency, and an honesty that didn't require the other person to be naive to believe in. "What does Crane actually want?" she said. "Not what he said. What does he want?" Nate thought about it. To not lose 12 years of assumed access to that land without getting something in exchange. Can you give him something in exchange? Depends what he's willing to take. Then find out, she said. Have the conversation, but not as a concession, as a business arrangement. Your land, your terms, and if there's a grazing agreement to be made, it's made in writing with Arthur Cobb present. Nate looked at her. You think he'll agree to that? I think Gerald Crane is a man who's been operating in the assumption that this situation would never be directly addressed, she said. He's been doing it long enough that some part of him believed it. The survey removed that. Now he needs a path forward that lets him keep his dignity while adjusting to the reality. She paused. Most people will take a fair deal if it's offered at the right time and in the right way. The key is not letting him turn the negotiation into a reversal. Nate set down his cup. When did you figure all this out? On the drive home from the committee meeting, she said. I've been waiting for the survey to be filed before doing anything with it. He looked at her with that expression that she had been carefully not naming, the one that was quieter than approval and more specific than trust, the one that appeared at the kitchen table at night and in the yard sometimes and once, briefly, when she had knelt in the snow to fix General's broken collar buckle, and looked up to find Nate watching her from the porch with an expression that he'd straightened out of before she could fully read it. I'll talk to him tomorrow, Nate said. I'll set up the meeting with Cobb for the following week. Good, she said. She went back to the accounts, but he didn't move immediately. He stood at the counter for a moment and then said, Evelyn. She looked up. What you said. About most people taking a fair deal if it's offered at the right time and in the right way. He paused. That's not something you know from accounts management. No, she said. It isn't. Where does it come from? She thought about Daniel, who had been a gentleman and a fair one, and who had known how to negotiate a bad harvest with a grain buyer without making an enemy. She thought about the 8 months alone on the farm, the conversations with the bank's man that she'd had to manage carefully enough to buy herself time without promising things she couldn't deliver. She thought about the boarding house in St. Louis, where she'd negotiated a reduced rate by offering to help with the laundry, and had understood that the negotiation was really about the landlady's overwork and not about money. From paying attention to people, she said. A long time of it. He nodded once, slowly, in the way he had of receiving information and placing it correctly. I'm going to need you in the meeting with Cobb, he said. I know, she said. The meeting happened on a Thursday, 8 days after Gerald Crane's visit to the ranch yard. Arthur Cobb's office above the general store held 5 people with the slight crowding of a space designed for 2. Cobb at his desk, Nate and Gerald Crane in the chairs across from it, and Evelyn and an associate of Cobb's named Harmon standing to one side because there were no more chairs and neither of them had asked for one. Gerald Crane had looked at Evelyn when she walked in with a look that covered surprise, adjustment, and a rapid recalculation in the space of about 3 seconds. He had come prepared for a conversation with Nate. He was not quite prepared for Evelyn, which was not an accident. She said, Mr. Crane, in a tone that was entirely pleasant, and offered him her hand, which he shook. And then she moved to stand beside Harmon and didn't say anything for the first 20 minutes while Cobb laid out the legal situation, and Crane's attorney, a man who had arrived from Milford and had the slightly rumpled look of someone who'd made the trip faster than he'd planned, made the counter-arguments that Crane's attorney was obligated to make. What she was watching was not the legal exchange, which was proceeding as expected. She was watching Gerald Crane, the way he held his jaw. The moments when his attorney said something that relaxed him slightly, and the moments when his expression tightened. The place where the argument he'd prepared for gave way to a position he hadn't fully worked out. It came when the attorney finished his prepared argument and Cobb summarized the legal position for the 4th time. The survey was filed, the record was established, the 230 acres were documented as Blackwood property. And Gerald Crane sat with his hands on his knees and said, So what I want to know is what Nate is going to do about it. It was an odd thing to say. It was the sentence of a man who had run out of his prepared argument and was falling back on something more fundamental. The expectation that there was a relationship here between men who had been neighbors for years that would shape what happened regardless of what the document said. Evelyn said, He's going to maintain his property, Mr. Crane. The question is what kind of working relationship you and he have while he does. Everyone looked at her. Gerald Crane looked at her with the full attention of a man being addressed directly on a significant matter by someone he hadn't expected to be a relevant participant. "I've been looking at the grazing records for the western section," she said, and spread the paper she'd brought on the corner of Cobb's desk. A single page, the summary she'd prepared, clear and unambiguous. "The section supports approximately 60 head over a winter season. If Blackwood Ranch were to offer a grazing lease on a portion of the western section, documented, at fair market rate renewable annually, that would give your operation reliable access through a legitimate arrangement rather than a disputed one." She paused. "A legitimate arrangement protects you legally as much as it does us. Right now you have no documentation on that land at all." Gerald Crane looked at the paper. He looked at Nate. Nate was watching him with the patient attention of a man who had decided to let someone else drive and was trusting the driver. Crane's attorney leaned over and said something quiet. Crane listened. Then he said to Evelyn, "What rate are you talking about?" She told him. It was fair. She had looked up comparable arrangements and priced it honestly, not advantageously. He would know the number was fair. That was the point. Another quiet conversation with his attorney. Then Crane looked at the paper again, then at Nate. "You'd put this in writing." "We'd put it in writing," Evelyn said. "Mr. Cobb can draft it today if you're prepared to agree in principle." Crane was quiet for a long moment. The room was quiet with him. The particular quality of a moment where a decision is being made in real time, and everyone present understands it, and no one wants to disrupt it with a word in the wrong direction. "In principle," Crane said finally. Cobb reached for his pen. They left the office an hour later with a drafted agreement that both parties would sign the following week after their attorneys had reviewed it. The supplier complaint was unaffected. That was a separate matter, and Evelyn had kept it so, firmly and without apology, when Crane's attorney had tried to include it in the discussion. On the street outside, Gerald Crane stopped before getting into his buggy and looked at Evelyn with an expression she found difficult to categorize. Not gratitude. It was too complicated for gratitude. Not hostility. The moment for that had passed. "Dorothy was right that you were something different," he said. "Dorothy was right about a number of things," Evelyn said, "and wrong about a few." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded, once, and got in the buggy. Nate watched the buggy go and then looked at Evelyn. "Dorothy Crane told him to be careful of you," he said. It was not quite a question. "Probably," Evelyn said. "That's all right." "Why?" "Because being someone people are careful of is different from being someone people don't respect," she said. "One of those is a problem. The other is useful." He looked at her on the cold street with the afternoon light going thin and the town of Red Hollow carrying on its ordinary business around them, and the expression that she had been carefully not naming was there again, clear enough this time that not naming it was a choice rather than an uncertainty. She looked back at him. "We should get back," she said. "Tom said he wanted to talk to you about the south pasture fencing before dark." "We should," he said, and didn't move for a moment. Then they went to the wagon and drove the 40 miles home in the December cold, and somewhere around the 20th mile she fell asleep against the wagon side with her coat pulled up, which had never happened before. She had always been awake for the whole drive, alert and calculating. She wasn't aware of falling asleep. She was aware of waking up, though. The ranch was in view, its shapes familiar now, the barn and the house, and the outbuildings exactly where they were supposed to be. The dogs were probably at the gate. The girls were probably in the kitchen with Willis or Pete, doing something that required supervision and wasn't getting it. Nate hadn't woken her. He'd let her sleep the whole second half of the drive. She sat up and straightened her coat. He kept his eyes on the road. "I fell asleep," she said. "You did," he said. "You should have woken me." "You needed the sleep." She looked at him in the last of the afternoon light. He kept his eyes on the road the way people kept their eyes on roads when they were aware of being looked at and had decided not to look back until they were ready. She let it go. But she remembered it. The specific fact of him driving 40 miles in the cold without waking her. The decision it represented. The kind of consideration that didn't announce itself but accumulated. The way all the things that actually mattered accumulated, in small quantities over time, until one day you looked at the sum and understood you were holding something real. When they pulled into the yard, General and Senator were at the gate exactly as she'd expected. Lily's face appeared in the kitchen window for approximately 1 second before disappearing, which meant she was coming to the door. Rose was probably still in the yard doing something with Cal Reyes and the equipment she'd been studying since November. She climbed down from the wagon, and the cold hit her, and the ranch smelled of horses and wood smoke and the specific northern Montana cold that she had started to think of as her cold. This place is cold, the cold that belonged to where she lived. Where she lived. She had not used those words in her own mind until this moment, and they arrived with the particular weight of things that have been true for a while before you find the words for them. Lily came out of the front door at a pace that violated several of Evelyn's guidelines about running in cold weather, her coat half on and her face lit with the specific urgency of a child who has been waiting to report something. "Pete taught me to tie a lasso knot," Lily said, running across the yard. "A real one. And Rose broke the pump handle, but Cal says he can fix it, and it wasn't really her fault because the metal was already weakened from the cold." Evelyn received all of this information and the small person delivering it with one arm. Was Cal's assessment that the metal was already weakened before she broke it, or after? "Before," Lily said firmly. "Definitely before." Evelyn said. She walked toward the house with Lily attached to her arm, and she could hear Nate behind her talking to Tom Garrett about the fencing, the normal sounds of the end of a working day. And she thought about the meeting in Arthur Cobb's office, and Gerald Crane saying in principle, and Dorothy Crane in the committee room recalibrating, and the supplier complaint moving steadily through Cobb's formal process, and Tom Garrett in the kitchen saying good catch, and Bud's healed hand that he'd shown her last week with the slight proud embarrassment of a man unused to being taken care of. She thought about the woman on the platform. She thought about what that woman had not known. Standing there with her arithmetic and her worn suitcase and her daughter's hands, running numbers that didn't add up, in a town that had made its decision and was waiting for her to leave. That woman had not known about Tom Garrett, about Rose's not conversations with Cal Reyes, about the feel of knowing a 40-mile road well enough to fall asleep on it, about the particular shift in a man's expression when he was deciding to trust something he hadn't planned to trust. She had not known about any of it. She pushed open the kitchen door, and the warmth came out and wrapped around her, and she went inside. The Vernon Mills complaint settled in February, 6 weeks after Arthur Cobb filed it. Mills did not contest it in the end. Evelyn had suspected he wouldn't. A man who had been running a quiet, short-changing operation for years depended on that operation remaining quiet, and the moment it became a matter of formal record, the thing that had made it work disappeared. He agreed to repay the documented discrepancy amount across 3 installments, signed a revised supply agreement with new verification terms, and did not return to Blackwood Ranch personally. A younger man from his operation handled deliveries going forward, and every load was counted before any invoice was signed, and the numbers matched every time. It was not a dramatic resolution. There was no confrontation, no final reckoning in the street, just paperwork and signatures, and the quiet close of a door that had been left open too long. Nate told her on a Thursday evening, the same way he told her most things, directly, without preamble, while she was at the kitchen table with the accounts. She looked up from the ledger. He said Mills had agreed. She nodded. He sat down across from her and they went over the adjusted figures for the quarter, and that was that. Later, when the house was quiet and the girls were asleep and the fire had gone down to coals, she sat alone in the kitchen for a while and let herself feel the full weight of what the past 4 months had been, not the satisfaction of outcomes. She'd learned to be careful with that, because outcomes had a way of producing new problems that satisfaction made you slow to see. But something quieter, the feeling of having carried a thing the full distance it required. The grazing lease with Gerald Crane was signed the same week. Dorothy Crane appeared at the following committee meeting without visible acknowledgement that anything had changed between them, which Evelyn respected. The fund now included the Pickett family and Mrs. Sands in its distribution, and Helen Marsh had brought 2 additional names that the committee had discussed and approved with less friction than Evelyn expected. The social architecture of the committee had not been dismantled. It wouldn't be, and trying to dismantle it would have been wasteful when redirecting it was possible. But the current ran differently now. Not because Evelyn had forced it, but because she had offered a direction that was genuinely useful, and the women who cared about doing real work had moved toward it. In March, the land came alive the way Montana land did in spring. Not gently, not with any of the softness that the word spring implied in other places, but with a sudden violent insistence, the snow retreating in a matter of days and the mud arriving to replace it, and the grass coming up through the mud with the stubborn determination of something that had been waiting under the ground all winter and was not interested in further delays. The cattle moved. The hands worked the long days that spring required. Tom Garrett directed the operation with the competence of a man who had been doing it for years and did not need supervision, only coordination, which Evelyn provided through the supply management and the schedule and the 100 small decisions that kept a working ranch functioning as a whole rather than as separate parts. One morning in late March, Rose came in from the near barn with grease on her coat and the expression of a person who had solved a problem. Cal Reyes had been working on the water pump mechanism for a week. Apparently Rose had spent the previous afternoon watching him and had come in before breakfast to apply a conclusion she'd reached overnight. "It works," she said. "The pump?" Evelyn said. "The pump," Rose confirmed. Cal was approaching it from the seal. The problem was the pressure fitting. She was 7 years old. Evelyn looked at her daughter. The grease, the certainty, the complete absence of any sense that fixing a pump at dawn before breakfast was unusual, and felt something that she could not have explained to anyone who hadn't spent a year and a half watching a child learn to be afraid of the world and then, slowly, learn to stop. "Go wash your hands," she said. "Breakfast is almost ready." Rose went to wash her hands. She did not appear to feel that any further discussion of the pump was necessary. Lily, who had come down from upstairs in the middle of this exchange, said, "Pete's going to teach me to ride today. A real ride, not just the yard." "When did Pete agree to that?" Evelyn said. "Yesterday. He said I was ready." Lily paused. "He might not remember agreeing, but he agreed." Evelyn put the biscuits on the table. "We'll discuss it with Pete at breakfast." Pete, when asked at breakfast, looked at Lily with the expression of a man retrieving a conversation he had genuinely forgotten and then confirming to his own mild surprise that yes, he had said that. He looked at Evelyn. "She is ready," he said. "I wouldn't have said it otherwise." "After chores," Evelyn said. "And Tom Garrett comes." Tom, from the end of the table, said, "I was already planning to," with the tone of someone who had known this conversation was coming and had positioned himself accordingly. Nate, who had been drinking his coffee and reading this exchange with the quiet attention he brought to the ordinary mornings of the household, looked at Evelyn across the table. She looked back. Something passed between them that didn't require words. The specific recognition of two people who have built something together and are, in an ordinary moment over breakfast, aware of what they built. It had not been declared. They were not people who declared things easily, either of them. What they had built had grown from the practical foundation Nate had described on the platform in October, not from romance, not from the kind of feeling that arrived ready-made, but from the repetition of honest days and the accumulation of small choices made in the same direction. It had grown the way the grass was growing now in the March mud, from underneath and without announcement, because the conditions were right and the thing had somewhere to go. He had not said the word love. She had not said it either, but 2 weeks ago, when she had come in from the cold, after a difficult day managing a supply delay and a disagreement between two of the hands that had required more patience than she'd had available, he had put coffee in front of her without being asked and sat down across from her and said simply, "Tell me about it." And she had. All of it. The supply delay and the hands and the particular tiredness of managing people when you had nothing left. He had listened the whole way through. He had not solved it or reframed it or offered the perspective she should have had. He had just listened, and when she was done, he said, "That was a hard day, and that was enough." She thought about that now, at the breakfast table in the March light, with her daughters and the ranch hands and the sounds of a working morning organizing themselves around her. She had been a woman standing at the end of a platform with nothing. She was aware of that fact most days, not as a wound anymore, but as a reference point, a place from which to measure distance. The distance was considerable. Not because the ranch had made her safe, the land was still hard and the winters were still serious and the accounts still required vigilance, and people still sometimes looked at her and saw the mail-order bride from the program, rather than the woman who had restructured the supply chain and turned the committee's fund toward families that actually needed it. The distance was not a distance from difficulty. It was a distance from the particular helplessness of having no ground to stand on. She had ground now. She had built it, alongside a man who had recognized something in her before she'd fully recognized it in herself. and alongside daughters who had grown into this place with the adaptability of children who trust their mother enough to follow her into the unknown, and alongside a group of men who had started out watching and waiting and had ended up being the kind of people you called on in a storm. None of it was what she had imagined when she wrote those careful letters to 7 different men over 14 months. She had imagined safety as a destination, a condition you arrived at and stayed in. She understood now that it wasn't a destination. It was something you built every day, imperfectly, with the people around you, from the ordinary materials of work and honesty and the willingness to be useful in ways that mattered. After breakfast, Tom Garrett took Lily out to the paddock for her first real ride on a horse named Biscuit, who was 16 years old and had not been surprised by anything in a decade. Evelyn watched from the yard. Lily on the horse was both terrifying and completely right. She sat too loosely and held the reins wrong and had an expression of absolute determination that suggested she would fall off and get back on until she got it correct. Rose came and stood beside Evelyn. They watched together. "She's going to fall," Rose said. "Probably," Evelyn agreed. "And then she'll get back on." "Yes." Rose considered this. "That's how she does everything." "It is," Evelyn said. Rose was quiet for a moment, then, "Is that how you did it? When things were hard?" Evelyn looked at her daughter, 7 years old, with grease still faintly visible on her wrist from the pump she'd fixed before breakfast, watching her sister on a horse with the steady attention of someone who was always paying attention to more than one thing. "More or less," Evelyn said. "Sometimes I fell further before I got back up, and sometimes I wasn't sure I was going to, but I got back up." Rose nodded slowly. "Because of us," she said, not asking for confirmation, just locating the fact correctly. "Because of you," Evelyn said. "And because of me." Rose considered this distinction. Then she nodded again and went back to watching Lily, satisfied that the accounting was accurate. This was the thing people didn't understand when they looked at the woman on the platform and saw desperation. What they saw was real. She had been desperate, in the specific and practical sense of a person who has run out of alternatives and is standing in the last available place. But what they didn't see was what was underneath the desperation, what had been there the whole time and had not been extinguished by the loss of the farm, or the death of Daniel, or the 14 months of careful hope followed by careful rejection. She had survived everything that came before Red Hollow. By the same method, she looked at what was in front of her, she assessed it honestly, she decided what could be done, and she did it. Not because she was exceptional, not because she was fearless. She had been afraid most of it, quietly and without sharing the information. But because she had learned, somewhere in the years of difficult things, that waiting to not be afraid before acting was a condition that would never arrive, and the only alternative to acting afraid was not acting at all. She had acted. The rest had followed. Not easily, not cleanly, not without cost. But it had followed. Lily did fall, 20 minutes into the lesson. Biscuit stopped politely. Tom Garrett caught the situation before it became worse. Lily got back on with the expression of someone who had expected this and was not remotely deterred. Nate came to stand beside Evelyn. They watched Lily get back on the horse. "She's going to be a good rider," he said. "She's going to be a determined rider," Evelyn said, "which might be more useful." He made the sound that had become, over 5 months, the sound she recognized as his laugh. Contained, dry, arriving slightly after the moment that prompted it, like a man who had forgotten he was allowed to find things funny and was still getting used to remembering. She did not look at him when he made it. She kept her eyes on Lily and the horse and the wide Montana morning, and she felt the cold March air on her face and the ground solid under her feet, this particular ground that she had built her life on, and she did not say anything. Some things didn't need to be said to be real. The mail-order bride nobody wanted had arrived at the end of a platform in October with 2 daughters and a worn suitcase and the last of her arithmetic. She had not been rescued from that platform. She had walked off it into hard country with her eyes open. That was the part that mattered. That was the part that was always going to matter.